I'm Dee Jackson, Assistant Curator of Medieval and Renaissance Manuscripts at the Morgan Library and Museum. Today we'll be taking a close look at the Medieval Bestiary or Book of Beasts. But before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about why I chose this particular topic. I joined the Morgan in March, but before that, I worked in the UK, and it was in London that I started to explore medieval perceptions of the natural world. While working at the British Library, I catalogued my very first bestiary, and I also helped to curate an exhibition of medieval manuscripts owned by the English monarchs down through the century. And here I'm showing you the opening of that exhibition with Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. This exhibition sparked my interest in the symbolic and allegorical significance of animals, particularly the lion, featured on the English royal arms. My research extended to actual lions brought from Africa to England in the 12th century and incorporated in the Royal Menagerie at the Tower of London. There they embodied the power and nobility of the king. Held by the Natural History Museum in London, this medieval lion skull, discovered during excavations of the Tower Moat in 1937, offers tangible evidence of a Barbary lion in the Royal Menagerie 700 years ago. It also offers evidence of the exchange in goods between distant countries in medieval Europe. Once stretching across North Africa, from the Atlas Mountains to Egypt, Barbary lions are now extinct in the wild. In 2009, increasingly concerned with the preservation of animals, I became a fellow of the Zoological Society of London, a global leader in conservation. And in 2010, I published a book on the natural, social, and cultural history of the lion. My long-standing interest in animals is the basis for my talk today, entitled Into the Wild, the Medieval Book of Beasts. 62 illuminated bestiaries are preserved in collections worldwide, and the Morgan's Worksop Bestiary is among the very finest. Made in England around 1185, it takes its name from the town of Worksop in Nottinghamshire, for reasons that I'll explain later. Measuring approximately 8 by 6.5 inches, the volume has 120 parchment leaves, that's 240 pages. Filled with richly colored paintings, which must have attracted the attention of Pierpont Morgan, the manuscript was acquired by him in 1902. It was standard practice for medieval manuscripts to be made by teams of craftspeople working collaboratively. Several scribes copied the text in the Worksop Bestiary, and at least 3 artists supplied the illustrations, and possibly more actually. Although the manuscript is over 800 years old and shows some signs of use, it is in remarkably good condition, never touched up or restored. Unlike paintings on panels or walls, these images have, for the most part, retained their vibrancy. The most outstanding feature of the bestiary is its cycle of illustrations. 106 images embellished with gold that was beaten into very thin sheets, applied to the parchment, and then burnished to a high shine. The Worksop Bestiary and one other closely related manuscript, now in St. Petersburg, are the earliest painted bestiaries that have come down to us. On the left, we have the mythical manticore, a human-headed beast, and on the right, 2 other legendary quadrupeds. As you can see from these pages, illuminated bestiaries contain imaginary creatures as well as actual animals. They are not zoology textbooks or field guides, but allegorical treatises explaining the natural world in terms of Christian principles and morals. Different versions of the bestiaries circulated in the Middle Ages in both Latin and vernacular languages. drawing on a variety of sources, including classical authors. The anonymous writers of the bestiaries explained animal characteristics and behaviors to make moral points. The key message of medieval bestiaries is that the physical world was created by God to reveal spiritual truth. This message is conveyed by the Worksop Bestiary from the very first page onwards. The heading at the very beginning of the book, written in red, reads, Incipit liber de naturas bestiarum et earum significationibus. Here begins the book of the natures of beasts and of their significance. Below, in a large initial B for bestiarum, the first word of the text, the resurrected Christ is depicted, holding a staff topped with a cross, a symbol of his victory over death. At the bottom of the page, we see a pair of lions with their cubs. The female lion has a mane, just like her mate, reflecting the limited understanding of the sexual dimorphism of the animal by the English artist, who was unfamiliar, obviously, with the lion. The images of Christ and the lions may seem unrelated, but they are conceptually linked. As explained in the text, lion cubs are born dead, but come to life after 3 days when their father breathes on them. Lions were therefore seen as a fitting symbol of Christ, who died on the cross, but was resurrected by God the Father on the 3rd day. Some bestiaries contain fewer than 50 animals, and others, like this one, have more than 100. The order in which the creatures appears also varies, but all bestiaries begin with the lion, and he's described in the text as the king of the beasts. The Worksop Bestiary begins with mammals, followed by sections on birds, fish, serpents, and finally worms. Consistently throughout the volume, the images of the animals come first, and then we have their descriptions. A wide range of animals are featured and assessed. Dogs, for example, are said to be the cleverest animal of all, perceptive and loyal creatures who recognize their own names and love their masters. The bestiary lists different jobs performed by dogs, including tracking and hunting, protecting sheep, and guarding houses, all canine jobs to this very day. Underscoring the animal's loyalty and intelligence, this image shows a faithful dog grieving for his murdered master. You see that in the foreground. Here's the murdered individual and his grieving dog. And then the dog springing up to identify and apprehend the murderer. The implication of the story is that although sinners may be able to hide their evil deeds from other people, God and his creatures will discern the truth. The dog is the only animal in the Worksop Bestiary to be granted 3 images rather than 1, signaling its unique relationship with humans. For sake of time, I won't discuss the other images, but you can see them and the fully digitized manuscript on the Morgan website. And I believe that one of my colleagues is putting a link to that website into the chat right now. If you look closely, you can see that the artist has drawn this composition in pen and ink, using fine lines to convey details, such as strands of hair, and to create convincing expressions and gestures. The pen employed was, of course, a quill made from a feather. The Latin word for feather is penna, the root of our English word pen. Pigments were then applied as a wash, permitting the drawing to show through. The leaves of the manuscript are made of parchment, specially prepared animal skins, receptive to ink and colors, and incredibly durable. This pen, ink, and wash technique is perhaps even more apparent in this image of the prophet Amos herding goats, in which the confident strokes of the pen reproduce the hairy texture of the animal's coats and the prophet's flowing beard and hair. Medieval artists pioneered many of the techniques used by artists to this very day, and they were equally skilled and imaginative. For example, in order to convey the gleaming feathers of the magical Ursinian bird, the artist rendered it entirely in gold leaf. And if you look at the last line of text, you can see here described, the bird is described as having plumarum fulgentium, that is refulgent plumage. A remarkable feature of the manuscript is the integration of text and image. This was achieved by careful coordination between scribes and artists. The manuscript's parchment leaves would not have been bound together until the book had been entirely completed. During production, the loose sheets would have been distributed to different craftspeople who would have worked on them independently. First, the pages were ruled and spaces allocated to text and images. Sketches of the compositions were made next, in lead point, before the text was copied line by line. Next, gold leaf was applied, and finally, the images were painted. It's obvious that the sketches were made before the text was copied, because when the elements of the images protrude into the text, the writing goes around them. And in here, for example, we're looking at the antlers of the stag, which are extending into the gap, intentionally left for that purpose by the scribe. Barely legible in the right margin and partly cut off by a binder who severely trimmed that foredge of the book, is the word cervus, or stag, which I've circled in red. This note, written by the craftsperson who supervised the work, told the artist which animal to paint in this place. Similar notes occur throughout the manuscript. On another leaf, featuring an antelope, we see this integration of text and image. The head of the hunter interrupts the word elephanti, elephant, written on the line of text above. Significantly, the scribe, anticipating this intrusion, left a space. Requiring even more planning was the placement of the satyr, whose foot and pinecone-topped staff jut out of this medallion. The variety in page design is evidence of the considerable care and labor lavished on this marvelous manuscript. Did medieval readers really believe in the existence of satyrs? Could they distinguish actual animals from mythical creatures? In the context of medieval bestiaries, the question is irrelevant, because both real and imaginary animals could just as effectively convey moral messages. In bestiaries in general, legendary and real animals are not divided into separate categories, but amalgamated. This is certainly true of the Worksop Bestiary, as shown in this description of the manuscript in our departmental files. Incidentally, this description and catalog entries for each Morgan manuscript can be accessed by anyone on our website. Compiled by a Morgan cataloger in 1937, this entry lists every beast in the manuscript in the order in which they appear. As you can see, the manticore, the perandus, and the yale, all legendary creatures, are followed by a list of real beasts. Then we come to a beast called the licrota. And here the cataloger cites its characteristics as given in the bestiary. A red beast with a mane like a lion, the head of a horse, a cleft tongue, erect ears, and a voice which sounds like speech. It's difficult to even begin to imagine what a composite beast described like this would actually look like. And it's no wonder that the cataloger has added in parentheses here, fabulous, question mark. The licrota, shown here, happily bounding across the page, is indeed drawn from the realms of fantasy. Another mythical creature is the bonacon, a half-bull, half-horse hybrid, allegedly native to Asia. Incapable of defending itself with its horns because they curl inwards, The bonacon is said to fend off attackers by spraying them with burning excrement. As the text explains, when the bonacon turns in flight, it is capable of discharging the contents of its intestines with such a noxious force that it covers 3 acres. Here we see the animal using its bottom as a blowtorch, and a group of hunters recoiling from the fiery feces. Sirens are probably the best known mythological creatures presented in the bestiaries. Half maiden, half birds. We all know they charm sailors with their songs, lulling them to sleep, wrecking their ships, and then they tear them to pieces. While her companions hold fish, the siren's version of a packed lunch perhaps, the siren on the left clutches a comb, a symbol of the vice of vanity. All 3 sirens hold their tails, a motif directly inspired by Roman art. Like most of the fabulous creatures mentioned in the bestiary, sirens have a very long history, having been conceived in the ancient world and mentioned by numerous classical authors, notably Homer in the Odyssey, of course. Interestingly, Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, dismissed sirens as absolute nonsense. I paraphrase, but that's basically what he said. Revered by medieval scholars, Pliny is cited numerous times in bestiaries, and his dismissal of the sirens would have been known to medieval Europeans, who were not quite as credulous as we tend to think. In the Worksop Bestiary, the sirens are equated with female prostitutes who impoverish their lovers, that is ruining them financially rather than literally sinking their ships. Misogynistic messages of this kind are occasionally found in the bestiaries, reflecting the monastic context in which many of them were conceived and used. The Worksop Bestiary was made around 1185, as I've said, probably in or near Lincoln, a city famous for its cathedral. And it's amazing to think that this cathedral, the cathedral was begun in 1072, just 6 years after the Norman conquest of England. A note in the bestiary, in a 12th century hand, it's inscribed at the very beginning of the volume, states that in 1187, it was given by Philip, a member of the clergy of the Cathedral of Lincoln, to the community of monks based at Radford, just down the road, Radford Priory, about 25 miles away. Bestiaries rarely contain clues about their intended readers, so this note is a very precious piece of evidence. Along with the bestiary, Philip gave the priory 4 religious manuscripts and a map of the world. As stated in the note, these items were to be used for the perpetual edification of the monks of Radford, which is now called Worksop, hence the name Worksop Bestiary. Evidently, the bestiary served as a spiritual guide for the brothers, and perhaps was used to teach young boys who entered the priory how to learn to read. Several other bestiaries are thought to have been used for teaching because they contain tiny marks to guide the pronunciation of words when the book was being read aloud. The legible script and the relatively short texts of the Worksop Bestiary would definitely be suited to beginner readers. And surely those vibrant images would have appealed to boys and helped them to memorize the religious truths conveyed by individual animals. The inscription ends with an anathema, a formal curse, stating that whoever steals the books or removes them from the priory will incur the wrath and indignation of God. Later owners of the Worksop Bestiary, who seem to have dodged divine displeasure, include William Morris, shown on the right, whose bookplate is pasted in the inside of the front cover. And a subsequent owner, Richard Bennett, his bookplate in the lower section of the cover. And finally, John Pierpont Morgan, who purchased the volume from Bennett in 1902 and is shown on the left. And his bookplate is at the center. The medieval preoccupation with animals was by no means restricted to Western Europe, but was a truly global phenomenon. The Morgan has a marvelous copy of an Islamic book of beasts made in northwestern Iran, in Maraga, in the late 13th century for a patron named Shams al-Din. The text in Persian is a translation of a 10th century Arabic work called On the Usefulness of Animals, composed by the famous scholar and physician Ibn Bakhtishu. The translation into Persian was commissioned by the Mongol sovereign Mahmud Ghazan, who ruled Iran from 1295 to 1304. A cosmopolitan lord, he sent delegations to Europe and Asia, and he could converse in several languages, including Frankish, probably meaning French, Arabic, Hindi, and even Chinese. According to the translator's preface, which is preserved in the Morgan manuscript, Ghazan, and I quote, focused his sublime attention on the collecting of books and of learning, and he sought them in every direction and gathered them. A statement which alludes to his pluralistic outlook and his refinement. The Morgan copy of The Usefulness of Animals, shown here in Persian, is illustrated with marvelous images combining elements of Arabic and Chinese painting. The tree in the background of this image of a dappled gray mare, for example, would not be out of place in a Chinese landscape. Western bestiaries and Islamic works of natural history, such as this one, sometimes contain the same information. This should not surprise us, since both Western and Islamic scholars derived material from Greek and Roman authors, including Pliny and Aristotle. It's no exaggeration to say that the Western European bestiary has its roots in Africa. The most important source of European bestiaries was a Greek text called the Physiologus, meaning naturalist, the naturalist, composed in Alexandria around the 2nd century AD, when Egypt was part of the Greco-Roman world. And actually the city of Alexandria, this Mediterranean port, was both a hub of commerce between Europe and the East and a center of intellectual and artistic exchange. The work contains brief accounts of animals, plants, and minerals that convey Christian messages. Illustrated versions of the Greek Physiologus, translated into Latin, such as this one, this 9th century copy, laid the foundation for the European Western bestiaries. Incidentally, no late antique copies of the Greek Physiologus have been preserved, so we don't have a manuscript from Alexandria from the 2nd or 3rd century. But the Morgan holds one of the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Greek Physiologus, which dates from the 11th century. And for those of you who are interested in such things, it's Morgan manuscript M397. An encyclopedia called the Etymologies, compiled by Bishop Isidore of Seville in the 7th century, also had an immense influence on the writers of the bestiaries. Isidore's encyclopedia, which survives in almost 1,000 copies, I mean, it was one of the most widely consulted reference works in the medieval period. It was a vital conduit, of classical learning that otherwise would have been lost. This copy of Isidore's encyclopedia was made in England at around the same time that the Worksop Bestiary was being produced. Bestiary authors merged information derived from Isidore with stories from the Physiologus and other sources. References to the Physiologus are scattered throughout the Worksop Bestiary, making its reliance and dependence on the Physiologus explicit. Many chapters incorporate phrases such as Physiologus asserts, or Physiologus sets forth, or Physiologus says, and this leads authority to the animal anecdotes and reveals the bestiary author's debt to the earlier text. So when you're saying Physiologus says or Physiologus asserts, you're basically saying the naturalist says or the naturalist asserts. This description of the roe deer begins, Est animal quod Grece dicitur dorcon, Latine vero capria. There's an animal that the Greeks call dorcon, but in Latin, capria. that is a roe deer. De hac physiologus dicit, quod amat altos montes. Of this animal, the naturalist says that it loves the high mountains. And that's precisely, of course, what we can see in the image above, two of these roe deer enjoying a not so very high mountain, but looking quite content the same. So this physiologus is kind of a constant theme that's coming up in the Worksop Bestiary. As you can see, Greek names for animals are given throughout the bestiary, like here dorkon, which may seem surprising given that after late antiquity, knowledge of Greek rapidly declined in the Latin-speaking West. The west of Europe didn't speak Greek that much, with the exception of parts of Italy. Very few people would have had an advanced understanding of the Greek language in 12th century England when the Worksop Bestiary was made. The presence of Greek terms in the text does not indicate familiarity with the language so much as an awareness of its significance as a link to the cultural inheritance of classical antiquity. A very common misconception is that all medieval Europeans lived narrow lives and they had a limited understanding of the world outside the confines of their communities. The contents of the Worksop Bestiary, however, reveal a global outlook. Many foreign place names and geographical landmarks are mentioned in this bestiary, including the Nile, Euphrates, and Ganges rivers, the Indian Ocean, the countries of Ethiopia, Arabia, and India. These references undoubtedly reflect the author's non-Western sources, including the physiologus, but they also demonstrate a curiosity about the larger world, because the writers of the bestiaries could have obviously suppressed these references or left them out, but they obviously felt they were meaningful and added value. Retaining them, that's a conscious choice. Among the cities mentioned are Antioch, Babylon, and Tyre, which you might be able to read here. This is Tyre right here, mentioned at the beginning of a section on fish in the bestiary. When the Worksop Bestiary was being made in the late 12th century, the port city of Tyre, conquered by the Franks and Venetians in 1124, was a principal town of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem and a bustling center of trade between East and West. So for readers of the Worksop, the original readers of the Worksop Bestiary, when they came to this page and they saw the word Tyre, they would not have only thought that that was a city mentioned in the Bible or a city of literary interest, but a city of contemporary relevance. An unfinished map is shown on the right here. In the Worksop Bestiary, we have an unfinished map. It's drawn in lead point, but it hasn't been painted in. Illustrates a geographical treatise that is included in the bestiaries, another indication of Western interest in distant lands. Both the treatise and the map were derived directly from a copy of Isidore of Seville's Etymologies, his famous encyclopedia, which I'm showing you here. Now, in Isidore's work, you can see a complete version of the map, which is divided into 3 quadrants: Asia at the top, Europe at the left, and Africa on the right, the lower right. And the T form is formed of bodies of water. So you can see the text is exactly taken from Isidore. If you would compare, if we had time to compare, you would see that this Worksop Bestiary simply takes this part of Isidore, these geographical treatises, and sticks it in the bestiary, just to stress this kind of global outlook. I'm showing you that. Numerous animals, exotic, I guess they would say exotic in the Middle Ages, but native to Africa, India, and Asia are mentioned in the Worksop Bestiary. So we've already seen the lion, but in addition to the lion, we have the crocodile shown here. Unlike any crocodile you've ever seen or thought of, probably. We also have the hyena, shown here, snacking on the corpse of a tonsured monk. And that's quite interesting because the text simply says that the hyena lives among tombs and feeds on corpses, but the artist has shown a monk, again reflecting this kind of monastic environment in which many bestiaries were used and produced. We also have the tiger, whom in this picture, it tells the story of the tiger who's been distracted by a hunter who has thrown a mirror behind him in order to divert the beast so that he can abduct her cub. And in the image, we can see that the tiger is entirely entranced with her own image, and she neglects to defend her offspring. We also have the elephant, which is said to be protected by a bulwark of ivory, of his tusks, of course, and to have superior intellect and memory, characteristics of the animal that are actually grounded in fact. The image of the elephant was intended to show how Persians and Indians charged into battle using the animal as a kind of proto-tank. So we have here a medieval version of a tank. Foreign birds are also described, such as the Indian parrot, which says hello so convincingly that if you didn't see it, you would think that a person was speaking. The snake charmer is another non-European element incorporated in the bestiary. According to the text, he uses special songs and incantations to draw the asp out of its pit. Although the asp is tempted to go to him, it presses one ear to the ground and sticks its tail in the others, so it will not be able to hear and be seduced by the snake charmer's songs and incantations. There is a disjuncture between the text and image in the Worksop Bestiary shown on the left, whose artist depicted the snake charmer as a man armed with a shield and a club. So he's not really so much as trying to charm the snake out of its lair, but to kind of beat it out. You know, it's not understanding what's going on. But in another English bestiary made about 20 years later, that one shown on the right, the artist has more successfully portrayed the activity of the snake charmer, who reads an incantation out from a book and is dressed in a toga, denoting his exotic and ancient origins. And even the gesture of his hand, he's sort of saying, trying, you know, come on out, you know, it's fine, you know, and just, but he's got, there's a different feeling in what's going on between the animal and the individual in that miniature. Now, you may well ask, how did an anecdote about a snake charmer find its way into a book made in England in the 12th century? And the amazing thing is that I can tell you very specifically how that occurred. The anecdote is derived from a hugely influential commentary on the Psalms, written by the 4th century theologian, St. Augustine. Now, St. Augustine was a native of Hippo in North Africa, now Annaba in Algeria, and he knew of the Marsi, the famous snake charmers and wizards of the Roman province of Latium. So he took that knowledge and he used it as a commentary on a psalm, and then his commentaries, which were also used as sermons, even by Augustine himself, were collected, preserved in manuscripts, and disseminated throughout Europe. So this story of the snake charmer sort of traveled in manuscript form across Western Europe. We'll end now with the Arabian cinnamon bird, perched with her chicks in a nest made from cinnamon twigs. The man with the sling at the base of the tree appears to be threatening the bird, but his primary target is the nest, because he would like to collect some cinnamon twigs so he can have some of the famed spice. As the text informs us, Arabian cinnamon could be sold for the highest possible price because merchants preferred it to any other kind. So the quality of the Arabian cinnamon was particularly high. The reference to the costly spice by the author of the bestiary exemplifies the medieval exchange of goods and ideas between East and West. The Worksop Bestiary, one of the most splendid surviving manuscripts produced in England in the late 12th century, is not a narrow parochial book, but a wide-ranging synthesis of animal lore, inspired by and drawing on diverse cultural traditions. Thanks very much for joining me today. I welcome your question.
First question regarding the snake charmer. It seems that the snake has, 4 legs and wings, and snakes were around in Europe at that time. So it seems sort of unlike the crocodile, which makes sense maybe is a more fantastical. Why would they incorporate those features into the creature?
You know, that's a really good question, and one that I've actually I've thought about myself. And I think there's more than one answer for it, to be honest. For one thing, the text itself describes the asp, which is an adder. You can use those changeably. This type of snake, the asp or adder, as a snake that runs. And it's supposed to be, it says it runs around steaming with its mouth open. And I think that description was probably meant to refer to a snake sort of slithering and hissing, with its mouth open. But the bestiary artists and obviously interpret it. They thought, well, if the creature's running, it's got to have legs. So, it's given it legs because it runs. The other reason I think that, for example, that doesn't explain the wings, and I think snakes are often depicted as dragons, not only in the bestiary tradition, but in medieval art in general. They're dragons, they're these kind of evil creatures, very much associated with the devil and his ways. So we even see winged-legged serpents in depictions of the Garden of Eden, right up into, say, the 16th century.
Our next question actually connects with a modern work. Is Aslan in the Chronicles of Narnia an explicit reference to the medieval linkage of Christ and lions?
I think that's a very profound idea, and we know C.S. Lewis was not only a writer of children's literature, but a medievalist. And I just cannot see that there would be. It must be a direct connection, absolutely. And so he was steeped in the bestiary lore. He and Tolkien and other people in England, in Oxford, they gathered together in pubs and they talked these things over. And I'm sure that is a direct link, absolutely.
The next question is there a connection between medieval bestiaries and fables of antiquity, such as Aesop's, using animals as characters to convey messages about behavior?
It's a really interesting question. I think in a sense, yes, and in a sense, no, because the bestiary tradition really, it's quite conservative, even in terms of the imagery. If you look at numerous copies of bestiaries, you'll see commonalities, right? So it's a very kind of conservative tradition. And the fable tradition is, again, it's its own thing, so they are separate traditions. You'll see that bestiary animals are very rarely anthropomorphized. We don't have bestiary creatures talking, for example, which we find in the fables. But the reason I think there is a connection, having said that, is because later bestiaries, they sort of lose the Christian moralization and talk more about ethics. So they begin to use animals to describe, good judgment or other kinds of attributes, just like the fables do. So I think at a certain point, those traditions come together and it becomes more about ethical behavior and what do you do in certain situations. And I think the traditions do come together there.
Our next question, one of the attendees brought up T.H. White's The Bestiary, the Book of Beasts, and wonders what source that he might have used.
Yeah, that's interesting. That was quite an influential text, an early translation, and still useful. He would have used a certain strand of the bestiaries. I mean, bestiary scholars have kind of divided the text. They've studied the text and looked at the different versions and tried to find origins for these differences to trace them back. And he used one particular strand of bestiary text for that book. And now what we're finding, though, is the scholarship is getting richer and richer and richer. There's a lot more editions of bestiary manuscripts that point out differences in manuscripts, and also there's more translations. So if you're interested in the bestiary, you can read many English translations now that will give you the stories. And it's I would encourage you to do that if you have any interest whatsoever. It's absolutely fascinating and enlightening to do that. So the literature's grown since White wrote his book, and it's become, I think, better in a sense, but his text was kind of one of the early and very, very popular, very popular.
Our next question is, would you see the Crusades and the occupation of Spain by people from the Middle East, Arabs, and people from North Africa as a source for exotic beasts?
It's interesting in Spain because do have a more than everywhere in Europe, cultures weren't as homogenous as we think. I mean, there were hybrid, there was transmission of ideas and peoples, and and in Spain it's particularly interesting. I worked on my PhD on Spain because I was so interested in the confluence of cultures there with Jewish, Islamic, and Christian cultures coming together. We do find it really fascinating expressions of that unity and the kind of sharing of cultural motifs in Spain, but we also have animals that are being brought through Spain to other parts of Europe. So, the North African lion is coming from Africa, across the strait to Spain. So, it's also a conduit not only for sort of ideas about animals and imagery about animals, but it's a conduit for actual animals, like those Barbary lions that I mentioned at the beginning when I talked about the lion skull. Yeah, they're entering Europe through Spain.
Our next question is, could you clarify, there was a little bit of questioning about the process. Did the writers start with or did the work created first with the writing and then followed by the illustrations? Because I think there's some questions, especially how do they know to leave the space for the illustration? Could you clarify maybe a little bit about that process again?
Yeah, I think one way we could do that is just to look at this map, because just ignore Isidore's map and just look at the Worksop Bestiary map, and you can see that there is a drawing there in what we call lead point, a lead basically, which leaves a mark if you draw with it. And you can see that there's the circle is drawn, it's not painted, and then so that kind of sketch showed that there needed to be an image there, right? And then the text was written in, and then that image would have been fully painted up. So in the cases where they're leaving spaces, we would have had the sketch coming first, the ruling, and then some kind of sketch, and then the text going around the space. It's like campaigns, it's campaigns of work on the same sheets that are being passed around the workshop.
And our final question is, could you recommend any more recent scholarship on bestiaries for those interested in learning more about them?
Definitely. There was a very important and large and well-attended exhibition on bestiaries recently in Los Angeles at the Getty. There is a catalog, of course, for that exhibition. Actually, I think there's one in this office, so I'll show people that. Not only is the catalog informative, but there's a very good bibliography at the back. So this, if you look at the bibliography and you look at the authors listed and the authors who contributed, you'll be able to learn a lot more about bestiary lore. And of course, you can come to the Morgan, and we'll be happy to talk about beasts. And there's more riches of beasts to be had at the Morgan. This is just looking at one aspect of it.
Well, thank you for this wonderful presentation, and thank you to all of our attendees who took part, who asked questions or left comments in our chat. For more programmings like this, we ask that you please go to www.themorgan.org/Morgan-connected. There you'll find our schedule of upcoming virtual presentations, our online exhibitions, as well as past recordings of past public programs and concerts. Thank you so much, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.